Some places are forgotten by the world for a reason, and some wait in silence for the right soul to return. The snow fell softly over Black Hollow Station, covering the rusted tracks and cracked platform benches in a pale sheet of winter white as Nathan Holloway eased his battered Ford pickup to a stop beside the old depot. The station stood at the edge of the valley like a ghost that had refused to leave, its tall brick walls stained dark by decades of storms, its broken windows reflecting the gray afternoon sky like blind eyes. A faded wooden sign still hung above the entrance, swinging gently in the wind with a long tired creak that sounded almost human. Black Hollow Station. Established 1912. Closed 1979. Nathan sat behind the wheel for a moment, one gloved hand resting on the steering wheel while the heater coughed weak warmth into the cab. Beside him, Ranger lifted his head slowly. The 6-year-old German shepherd stared through the windshield with sharp amber eyes fixed on the station as if he recognized something hidden beneath the silence. His ears twitched once. Then again. Nathan rubbed the dog's neck gently. "Yeah," he muttered softly. "Feels strange to me too." The road leading into town had been empty for miles except for pine trees and abandoned rail signs half buried in snow. Nobody bought places like this anymore. Especially not train stations left to rot for nearly 50 years. But Nathan had spent enough time in broken places to stop fearing them. Afghanistan had taught him that silence could be dangerous, but it could also heal a man if he listened carefully enough. At 40 years old, Nathan carried himself with the quiet steadiness of someone who had survived things he no longer spoke about. Broad shoulders beneath a weathered canvas jacket. Dark brown hair touched with silver near the temples. A face roughened by cold mornings, engine grease, and years spent sleeping in places that never truly felt like home. He stepped out into the snow, boots crunching softly against ice, and the cold mountain air filled his lungs with the scent of pine sap and frozen metal. Ranger jumped down beside him, landing lightly despite his size. The dog immediately turned toward the tracks. 3 rail lines stretched beyond the station and disappeared into the white forest beyond the valley. But it was track 3 that held Ranger's attention. He stood perfectly still staring toward it, tail low, body tense in a way Nathan knew well. Not fear. Focus. "Easy, boy," Nathan whispered. "Probably deer." But Ranger did not move. The wind drifted through the valley with a low hollow whistle, weaving between the old power poles and dead signal lights. Somewhere inside the station, something metallic tapped softly against another piece of metal. Clink. 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 Nathan climbed the station steps slowly and unlocked the heavy front door with the rusted key the county clerk had handed him that morning. The hinges groaned like an old man waking from a nightmare. Dust floated through the dim air inside the depot, glowing faintly in thin beams of pale winter light. The waiting room still held rows of wooden benches. Old train schedules curled on the walls. A brass clock above the ticket booth remained frozen at exactly 2:17. Nathan stared at it for several seconds before exhaling slowly through his nose. "Guess time stopped here a long while ago." Ranger padded quietly across the floorboards, nails clicking softly in the silence. Then suddenly he froze near the center of the room. His ears shot upward. A low rumble rolled deep in his throat. Nathan turned immediately. "What is it?" Ranger stepped forward cautiously and placed one paw against the floor near the old ticket counter. Then came the sound. Faint. Deep below them. A distant metallic vibration echoing beneath the station floor like steel grinding slowly against steel somewhere underground. Nathan's eyes narrowed. The sound lasted only 3 seconds before vanishing completely. Silence rushed back into the depot so fast it almost hurt the ears. Snow drifted outside the cracked windows. The frozen clock still pointed at 2:17. Ranger slowly backed away from the floor, never taking his eyes off it. And somewhere far beyond the valley, though no train had passed through Black Hollow in nearly half a century, a lonely whistle echoed through the mountains. Nathan did not sleep much that night. The station settled around him with the slow restless sounds old buildings made when winter pressed against their bones. Pipes clicked softly behind the walls. Wind slid beneath loose roof shingles with a low mournful hum. Somewhere outside, snow drifted across the empty tracks in delicate waves that glowed silver beneath the moonlight. Ranger lay near the small iron stove Nathan had managed to light inside the station master's office, but the dog never fully relaxed. Every few minutes his ears twitched toward the waiting room. Listening. Watching. Around midnight Nathan poured coffee into a chipped ceramic mug he had found in one of the cabinets. The faded railroad logo on its side had almost disappeared beneath years of dust. He stood beside the office window staring out at the frozen rail yard while steam curled slowly through the cold air. The valley beyond the station looked endless at night. Black pine trees climbed the mountainsides like shadows frozen in place. Snow softened everything except the tracks themselves. The steel rails still caught the moonlight sharply as though refusing to surrender completely to time. Nathan had always understood places like this better than crowded cities. Forgotten places. Quiet places. Places where memories stayed trapped inside walls long after people disappeared. Ranger suddenly stood. Not quickly. Slowly. Deliberately. His body stiffened as his amber eyes fixed toward the waiting room again. Nathan lowered the mug immediately. "What do you hear?" he asked quietly. Ranger gave no bark this time. He simply walked toward the center of the station floor where the strange vibration had come earlier. His paws moved carefully across the old wood planks until he stopped beside the ticket counter again. Then the dog lowered his head close to the floorboards. Nathan stepped closer. At first he heard nothing except the crackle of fire behind him. Then came a faint sound beneath the silence. Clang. A distant metallic echo deep underground. Not loud. Not close. But real. Nathan's eyes narrowed. The sound repeated again several seconds later. Clang. Clang. Like iron wheels touching old rail joints somewhere. Far below the earth. Ranger released a low uneasy growl from deep in his chest. Nathan crouched carefully and pressed his gloved hand against the floorboards. Cold wood greeted his palm at first. Then something else. A subtle vibration pulsing upward through the station floor. Rhythmic. Controlled. Almost mechanical. He counted automatically the way military training had taught him years ago. 7 seconds. Another vibration. 7 more. Another. Nathan slowly pulled his hand away. "That is not settling wood," he whispered. Ranger backed away from the spot and glanced toward track 3 visible through the cracked front windows. Snow continued drifting across the rails outside, untouched by anything living. Yet the uneasy feeling inside the station had changed. Nathan could feel it now. The building no longer felt abandoned. It felt occupied by something hidden beneath layers of silence and time. He grabbed his flashlight and heavy coat. "Come on, boy." The front door groaned as they stepped outside into the freezing air. The storm clouds had cleared enough for moonlight to spill across the valley in pale blue ribbons. Their boots crunched softly over fresh snow as they crossed toward track 3. Ranger moved ahead cautiously, nose low, breath fogging the cold night air. The old rail line disappeared into darkness beyond the station yard where pine trees swallowed the mountain pass whole. Nathan swept the flashlight along the tracks. Rust coated most of the steel, but halfway down the line something caught the beam. Fresh scrape marks. Long silver streaks cutting through the rust as if metal had touched metal recently. Nathan stared at them silently. That should have been impossible. No train had run through Black Hollow in nearly 50 years. Ranger suddenly froze beside the tracks. His ears stood high. Then slowly he turned toward the mountain beyond the station. A faint sound drifted through the valley. Not wind. Not trees. A whistle. Long, low. Distant. The unmistakable cry of a train somewhere deep beneath the sleeping mountains. Morning arrived pale and brittle over the valley, the kind of cold northern dawn that turned every breath into silver fog. Nathan stood outside the station holding a steaming cup of black coffee while Ranger paced slowly near the tracks, nose buried low against the frozen ground. The strange whistle from the night before still echoed inside Nathan's mind. He had heard enough trains during his childhood to know the sound had been real. Not wind. Not imagination. A train whistle carried a loneliness unlike anything else in the world, and whatever had cried through those mountains had sounded old. Older than the station itself somehow. The rising sun painted the snow in soft shades of blue and gold, but Black Hollow still felt trapped in shadow. The town sat nearly a mile downhill beyond the frozen rail yard, tucked between pine forests and the icy curve of the river. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys there, thin gray ribbons against the winter sky. Nathan decided he needed answers. Ranger climbed into the truck without hesitation, though the dog kept glancing back toward track 3 until the station disappeared behind the trees. The road into town curved steeply downhill past abandoned freight sheds and old signal towers leaning crooked with age. Most of the storefronts along Main Street looked weathered but alive in the stubborn way small mountain towns survived winter after winter. A hardware store. A diner with fogged windows. A barber pole turning slowly beside a brick building that smelled faintly of cedar smoke. People noticed Nathan immediately. Small towns always notice strangers. Especially strangers who bought places everyone else avoided. Conversations softened as he entered Miller's general store near the center of town. An old bell above the door rang softly when he stepped inside. Warm air carrying the scent of coffee beans and pine cleaner wrapped around him instantly. Ranger padded quietly beside him while snow melted from their boots onto the wooden floorboards. Behind the counter stood an older man with heavy shoulders and silver hair combed neatly beneath a faded railroad cap. His name tag read Eli Turner. The old man looked up slowly from his newspaper and studied Nathan with careful blue eyes. Then his gaze drifted toward Ranger. "That dog yours looks like he. Here's things most men miss," he said quietly. Nathan gave a faint smile. "Sometimes I think he does." Eli folded the newspaper carefully. "You are the fellow who bought the station." It was not a question. Nathan nodded once. "Needed somewhere quiet." The old man stared toward the frosted front windows for several seconds before speaking again. Black Hollow has never been truly quiet. Something in his tone made Nathan pay attention. He stepped closer to the counter. "You used to work the railroad?" Eli touched the brim of the old cap absent-mindedly. 32 years. His weathered fingers tightened slightly against the countertop. Mostly freight lines before the station closed. Ranger suddenly stopped near the doorway and turned toward the street outside. His ears rose high. Nathan noticed immediately. "What is it, boy?" The dog remained perfectly still, watching something unseen beyond the snowy glass. Eli noticed too. His expression changed subtly. Not fear exactly. Recognition. He is reacting to the tracks, is he not? Nathan looked back toward the old man slowly. "You know about that?" Eli exhaled through his nose. "Years ago, folks around here used to say certain sounds still traveled beneath the mountains after midnight." Nathan felt the room grow strangely colder despite the heater rattling nearby. "What sounds?" Eli hesitated. Then finally spoke in little more than a whisper. "Trains that were never meant to arrive." The store fell silent around them. Somewhere deeper inside the building an old refrigerator hummed softly. Outside, snow drifted across Main Street beneath the pale winter light. Ranger released a low, uneasy rumble deep in his chest. Eli glanced toward the dog again before leaning closer across the counter. "If you hear whistles after dark," he said quietly, "do not follow them into the mountain." Nathan stared at him without blinking. Why not? The old railroad man lowered his eyes toward the worn wooden floor. Because the last men who did never came back. The road back to the station felt longer after what Eli had said. Snow drifted lazily across the windshield while Nathan drove in silence through the narrow mountain pass, his fingers resting lightly against the steering wheel as Ranger sat upright beside him staring ahead with unwavering focus. The old railroad man's warning lingered in the truck like a shadow that refused to leave. Trains that were never meant to arrive. Nathan had spent years around frightened men during the war, and he had learned something important back then. Fear always wrapped itself around a truth before anyone else was willing to admit it existed. By the time Black Hollow Station emerged between the trees again, clouds had swallowed most of the afternoon light. The building looked even older now beneath the gray sky, its brick walls darkened by melting snow and years of forgotten winters. Ranger jumped out before the truck fully stopped. The dog moved quickly toward the platform, nails scraping softly across frozen wood. Nathan grabbed his toolbox from the back seat and followed him inside. The station greeted them with cold silence and the faint scent of rust, wet timber, and old paper. Somewhere overhead water dripped slowly through the damaged roof into a metal bucket with a hollow ping that echoed through the empty waiting room. Nathan removed his gloves and looked toward the large brass clock hanging above the ticket counter. Still frozen at 2:17. He climbed onto one of the wooden benches and carefully removed the clock from the wall. Dust coated the glass thickly enough to blur the hands beneath. Ranger watched from below, ears twitching toward the floor every few seconds. You really do not like this place, do you? Nathan murmured softly. The dog released a low breath but never took his eyes off the center of the room. Nathan carried the clock into the station master's office where pale daylight filtered through cracked blinds. He laid the heavy clock on the desk and opened the rusted back panel carefully with a screwdriver. Inside, the gears looked surprisingly clean for something untouched nearly 50 years. That bothered him immediately. Most abandoned mechanisms froze solid with time. But this one still smelled faintly of machine oil. Fresh enough that someone had maintained it long after the station closed. Nathan slowly turned one of the gears. With his thumb. Tick. The sound echoed sharply inside the office. Then another. Tick. Ranger suddenly stood. The dog turned toward the waiting room so quickly the chair beside him scraped against the floorboards. Nathan heard it too. A low vibration rolling beneath the station. Stronger than before. The office window trembled softly. Dust drifted from the ceiling beams in thin gray ribbons. Nathan walked back into the waiting room holding the clock in both hands. Tick. 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 The old mechanism had started moving again on its own. Slowly the minute hand crept forward across the cracked yellow face. Ranger backed away toward the front doors, ears pinned halfway down now. Nathan watched the clock carefully. The second hand moved in perfect rhythm with the vibrations under the floor. Every 7 seconds. Tick. Vibration. Tick. Vibration. Then suddenly the waiting room lights flickered once even though electricity had not worked inside the station for decades. A faint hum rose beneath the floorboards like distant machinery awakening somewhere deep underground. Nathan felt the hair rise slowly along the back of his neck. Ranger released a sharp bark and stared directly toward track 3 outside the front windows. Nathan followed his gaze. Snow drifted gently across the platform beyond the glass. Empty tracks stretched into the mountains beneath the fading daylight. Then, far down the line, a single yellow light appeared through the falling snow. Small. Distant. Moving slowly toward the station. Nathan stood motionless beneath the dim waiting room lights, the heavy brass clock ticking steadily in his hands while the distant yellow glow moved slowly through the snow beyond track 3. Ranger barked again, sharper this time, his body rigid with tension as the strange light drifted between the pine trees lining the old rail path. For several seconds Nathan could only stare. The glow looked exactly like the headlamp of an approaching locomotive, soft and golden against the storm-gray dusk. But there were no active rail lines within 70 miles of Black Hollow. The tracks beyond the station had been declared dead decades ago. The light should not have existed. Yet. It kept moving closer. Nathan stepped carefully toward the front doors, his boots creaking against the warped wooden floorboards. The vibrations beneath the station had grown stronger now. Not violent. Rhythmic. Alive. He could feel them through the soles of his boots in perfect intervals matching the clock still ticking inside his hands. Tick. 7 seconds. A deep pulse beneath the floor. Tick. Another pulse. Ranger paced beside the entrance, eyes fixed toward the snow-covered tracks. The dog's ears flicked constantly as if listening to several sounds hidden beneath the wind itself. Nathan slowly opened the station doors. Freezing air rushed inside carrying the sharp scent of snow, pine resin, and distant metal. The valley stretched silent before him except for the faint whistle echoing somewhere beyond the mountains. The yellow light continued drifting closer through the storm, but something about it felt wrong now. Too smooth. Too silent. Nathan had grown up around freight trains as a boy while his father repaired rail equipment in Pennsylvania. Real trains announced themselves through thunder and steel long before they appeared. But this one moved like a memory sliding through fog. Ranger stepped onto the platform first. Snow crunched beneath his paws while his breath curled pale into the darkening air. Nathan followed carefully, one hand gripping the flashlight clipped to his belt. The station behind them groaned softly as winter wind slipped through broken roof panels above. The closer the light came, the colder the air seemed to grow. Frost spread slowly across the old platform railings like white veins. Nathan narrowed his eyes toward track 3. Then suddenly the yellow glow stopped. About 200 yards beyond the station near the tree line. Completely motionless now. Ranger let out a deep uneasy growl. Nathan lifted the flashlight and aimed it toward the glow, but the beam barely reached through the thick curtain of snow. For a moment the valley became impossibly still. Even the wind faded away. Then came the sound. A metallic screech echoed softly through the mountains, followed by the slow grinding rhythm of wheels rolling over rails somewhere. Beneath the earth. Nathan felt the vibrations beneath his boots immediately. Stronger now. Much stronger. The old signal post beside track 3 suddenly flickered to life beside him with a burst of sparks. Red light flashed once against the falling snow. Then again. Ranger barked sharply and backed away from the tracks. Nathan turned toward the signal tower in disbelief. Rust covered nearly every inch of the metal housing, yet the signal arm above them slowly began to move. Inch by inch it lifted upward with a groan of ancient gears awakening after decades of silence. Nathan's heartbeat quickened. No electricity should have reached this place. No machinery should still function. Yet the entire rail yard suddenly felt as though something below it had awakened. The yellow light near the trees flickered once. Then vanished completely. Silence rushed back across the valley so suddenly it felt unnatural. Nathan swept the flashlight wildly across the snow-covered tracks, but there was nothing there now except drifting snow and darkness between the pines. Ranger stood frozen beside him staring toward the exact spot where the light had disappeared. Then the dog lowered his head slowly toward the rails beneath their feet and released a low mournful whine Nathan had never heard from him before. A sound not of fear, but recognition. That night the snow did not stop. It fell steadily across the valley in soft silent waves, covering the abandoned rail yard until the tracks looked less like steel and more like dark scars cutting through an endless white wilderness. Nathan sat alone inside the station master's office while Ranger rested near the doorway, though the dog never truly slept. Every few minutes his ears shifted toward the waiting room as if listening for something moving beneath the floor again. The brass clock rested on the desk beside Nathan, still ticking steadily despite having no visible power source. Tick. 7 seconds later the station floor vibrated softly beneath his boots. Tick. Another vibration. Nathan had stopped trying to convince himself there was a logical explanation. Some things in life arrive before understanding did. He had learned that. Overseas years ago, watching men survive explosions they should not have walked away from, or finding peace in places where peace had no business existing. Outside the office windows darkness pressed heavily against the station. Snowflakes drifted through the beam of the lantern Nathan had hung beside the ticket counter, glowing like tiny floating ashes. Around midnight Ranger suddenly lifted his head. The dog stood slowly, muscles tightening beneath his silver-gray coat. Nathan looked up immediately. "You hear it again?" Ranger moved toward the waiting room without hesitation. Nathan grabbed the flashlight and followed him. The old station seemed colder now. The air carried a damp metallic scent stronger than before, almost like rainwater trapped inside rusted pipes. Ranger stopped beside the ticket counter where the vibrations had first begun and lowered his nose toward the floorboards. Then he scratched twice against the wood. Nathan crouched beside him carefully. The floor beneath the counter looked different somehow. Cleaner. He brushed away years of dust with his glove and revealed faint markings carved into the wood near the wall. Numbers. 217, directly beneath them another symbol had been etched deeply into the floorboards. A small railroad insignia crossed with what looked unmistakably like a military crest. Nathan's chest tightened slightly. He recognized the style immediately. Army Corps transport markings. Mid-century. Possibly Cold War era. Ranger whined softly beside him and backed away from the wall itself. Nathan aimed the flashlight upward. The wooden panels behind the ticket booth appeared warped compared to the rest of the station. One section carried darker stains along the edges as if moisture had seeped through from somewhere hidden behind it. Nathan stood and pressed his hand carefully against the wall. Hollow. Ranger barked sharply the moment Nathan realized it. "All right," Nathan whispered. "You found something." He grabbed a pry bar from his toolbox and wedged it carefully between the wooden panels. The old nails groaned loudly as the boards slowly pulled free. Dust poured downward in gray clouds carrying the stale scent of trapped air. Untouched for decades. Behind the wall sat a narrow steel door nearly hidden inside the station structure itself. Thick riveted metal coated in rust. A heavy wheel-lock handle at its center. Above it, faded white lettering barely remained visible beneath layers of grime. Authorized freight access only. Nathan stared silently at the hidden door while Ranger stepped backward several feet, ears pinned halfway down now. The vibrations beneath the floor suddenly stopped completely. Silence swallowed the station so deeply Nathan could hear snow tapping softly against the roof overhead. Then the brass clock inside the office began ringing on its own. One loud metallic chime echoed through the empty station. Then another. Nathan turned sharply toward the office. The clock had stopped ticking. Its hands now pointed directly at 2:17 again. Ranger released a low uneasy growl toward the steel door. Nathan looked back at it slowly. Something cold moved through the cracks around the metal frame carrying the faint scent of oil and ancient stone. Then, from somewhere far beyond the hidden wall, came the unmistakable sound of a train horn echoing softly underground. Nathan barely noticed the cold anymore. The hidden steel door behind the ticket counter seemed to pull every ounce of warmth from the station itself, turning the waiting room into a place that felt suspended between memory and silence. Ranger stood several feet away watching the door carefully, amber eyes reflecting the dim lantern light while the distant train horn faded somewhere beneath the mountain. Nathan stepped closer to the metal surface. Rust covered most of it, but beneath the corrosion he could still make out faded military numbering stamped near the wheel-lock handle. The style looked older than anything modern. Early Cold War transport codes. The kind used for restricted freight movement after the Second World War. He ran his gloved fingers slowly across the steel. The metal felt strangely cold despite the faint warmth drifting through the cracks around its frame. Nathan pressed his ear gently against the door. At first he heard nothing except the quiet groan of winter wind outside. Then came a faint, mechanical hum deep below the station. Rhythmic. Steady. Like generators still running somewhere underground after decades of darkness. Ranger suddenly barked once toward the front entrance. Nathan turned sharply. Headlights swept briefly across the station windows from outside before stopping near the platform. A truck door slammed. Ranger moved toward the waiting room entrance with a low protective growl rumbling inside his chest. Nathan covered the hidden doorway quickly with the loose wooden panels and stepped out from behind the counter just as heavy boots crossed the platform outside. 3 slow knocks echoed against the station doors. Nathan opened them carefully. Snow swirled through the doorway carrying sharp mountain air into the depot. Eli Turner stood outside beneath the falling snow wearing a thick wool coat and the same faded railroad cap from the general store. Beside him stood another older man Nathan had never seen before. Tall and painfully thin with hollow gray eyes and a cane carved from dark wood. Neither man looked surprised to find Nathan awake. Eli glanced past him toward the station interior. "You heard it tonight," he said quietly. Nathan studied him for several seconds before answering. "I think there is something under this place." The taller man shifted uneasily at those words. Snow clung to the shoulders of his coat while the wind stirred softly through the platform behind him. "We told the county years ago to tear this station down," he muttered. Nobody listened. Nathan crossed his arms slowly. "Why?" Neither man answered immediately. Ranger stood beside Nathan now, eyes fixed on the stranger with the cane. The dog's posture remained tense but controlled. Finally Eli removed his cap and exhaled heavily into the cold air. "In 1953 a military freight train passed through Black Hollow during a snowstorm," he said softly. "Official records claimed it continued west through the mountains." His tired blue eyes lifted toward Nathan. "But it never reached the next station." Silence settled heavily across the depot. Somewhere behind the walls the hidden clock gave a single metallic tick. Nathan watched both men carefully. "You are saying the train disappeared?" The older man with the cane swallowed hard before speaking. "No," he whispered. "It arrived exactly where it was supposed to." Nathan felt the air shift around them somehow. Ranger released another low growl deep in his chest and slowly turned his head toward the ticket counter behind the hidden wall. Eli noticed immediately. His face lost color beneath the lantern glow. "You found something back there, did you not?" Nathan hesitated only briefly. Then he nodded once. Eli closed his eyes for a moment like a man carrying an old burden too long. Snow tapped softly against the station windows while the valley wind moaned through the empty rail yard outside. When Eli finally opened his eyes again, they carried something deeper than fear. Regret. "That door should never be opened," he said quietly. Then the station floor trembled violently beneath all 3 men for the first time since Nathan arrived at Black Hollow. Dust rained from the ceiling beams. Ranger barked sharply toward the hidden wall. And somewhere deep beneath the station, a train whistle echoed again, louder now than ever before. The tremor faded slowly beneath the station floor, but the silence afterward felt heavier than before, as though the mountain itself had exhaled something ancient into the frozen valley. Dust drifted lazily through the lantern light while Nathan steadied himself against the ticket counter. Ranger stood rigid near the hidden wall, ears high and eyes fixed toward the concealed steel door beneath the loose wooden panels. Eli Turner looked older somehow after the vibration passed. His weathered face had gone pale beneath the brim of his railroad cap, and the thin man beside him tightened both hands around his cane as if trying to keep them from shaking. Outside, snow hissed softly across the platform under the midnight wind. Nathan broke the silence first. "You knew something was down there all these years." Eli lowered his eyes toward the floorboards. Most of us only knew enough to stay away. The older man beside him swallowed hard before speaking quietly. My name is Walter Grady. My father worked freight control here back in '53. Nathan listened carefully while Ranger slowly paced closer to the hidden wall again. The military sealed the station for 3 weeks after the storm, Walter continued. Nobody was allowed near Track 3. They brought soldiers up from Denver. Trucks. Floodlights. Men with clipboards. His tired eyes drifted toward the waiting room windows where snow covered the empty rail yard beyond. Then suddenly one morning they left. No explanations. No train. Nothing. Nathan folded his arms slowly. And everyone just accepted that? Walter gave a weak bitter smile. People in mountain towns learn to live beside silence. Especially when the government tells them silence is safer. Ranger suddenly stopped moving. The dog's ears twitched sharply toward the hidden wall. Nathan noticed immediately. A faint sound had returned beneath the station. Not the whistle this time. Voices. Distant and muffled like echoes traveling through tunnels far underground. Nathan stepped closer to the concealed doorway, listening carefully. The voices faded in and out beneath layers of humming machinery and the low rhythmic clanking of metal against metal. Ranger scratched once against the floorboards. Then twice more. Eli backed away immediately. Do not open it, he whispered. You do not understand what waits below. Nathan turned toward him slowly. Then help me understand. For a long moment only the wind answered through the cracked station windows. Finally Eli removed something from inside his coat pocket and held it out silently. An old brass key attached to a weathered leather tag. Nathan stared at it carefully. The tag carried faded black lettering almost erased by time. Sublevel access. Track 3. Where did you get this? Nathan asked quietly. Eli looked toward the hidden wall with tired sorrow in his eyes. A man gave it to me the night the train disappeared. Walter shifted uneasily beside him. Eli, but the old railroad worker continued anyway. He came into town covered in snow around 3 in the morning. Said the mountain had swallowed something it was never meant to keep. Eli's voice dropped lower now. Before dawn he was gone. Nathan accepted the key carefully. The brass felt strangely warm despite the freezing air inside the station. Ranger moved beside him immediately, staring at the key with intense focus. Then the station lights flickered again. Once. Twice. The old signal bell outside suddenly rang loudly across the platform. All 4 men froze. Clang. 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 The sound echoed through the valley like an alarm awakening after half a century of silence. Nathan rushed toward the front windows. Beyond the swirling snow, Track 3 glowed faintly beneath the darkness. Thin lines of pale yellow light now pulsed beneath the rails themselves, stretching into the mountains like veins waking beneath frozen skin. Ranger barked sharply toward the hidden wall behind them. Nathan turned just in time to see the loose wooden panels slowly shift outward on their own. A cold breath of air rolled from the darkness behind them carrying the unmistakable scent of oil, stone, and burning coal from somewhere deep underground. Nathan could feel the cold air pouring from behind the hidden wall long before he stepped closer. It rolled through the station in slow waves carrying the scent of coal smoke, machine oil, and something older buried beneath both. The loose wooden panels creaked softly outward as though unseen pressure had finally broken whatever seal had held them shut for decades. Ranger stood directly beside Nathan now, shoulders tense beneath his thick coat, amber eyes fixed on the darkness behind the steel door. The dog did not bark this time. He only watched. Eli Turner backed farther away from the ticket counter until he reached the waiting room benches. Walter Grady gripped his cane tightly enough for his knuckles to pale beneath the lantern light. Outside, the signal bell continued ringing across the rail yard while pale yellow light pulsed beneath track 3 in slow steady rhythms like a heartbeat trapped under snow. Nathan looked down at the brass key in his hand. Sublevel access. Track 3. The metal felt warmer now. Almost alive. He stepped toward the steel door carefully and brushed years of dust from the heavy wheel-lock handle. The faded military markings along the frame seemed clearer somehow beneath the flickering lantern. Glow. Restricted Transport Division. Federal Freight Authority. Authorized personnel only. Ranger lowered his head slightly and released a soft uneasy whine. Nathan rested one hand briefly against the dog's neck. "It is all right," he whispered, though he no longer believed the words himself. Then he slid the brass key into the rusted lock. For one long second nothing happened. The station fell silent except for wind moving through the broken rafters overhead. Then deep inside the mechanism came a heavy metallic click. Eli closed his eyes immediately. Walter whispered something under his breath Nathan could not fully hear. The steel door shuddered softly as though pressure shifted somewhere far below the mountain. Nathan gripped the wheel-lock handle with both hands and slowly turned it clockwise. Ancient gears groaned deep within the wall. Dust drifted from the ceiling beams overhead. Ranger stepped backward but never looked away from the opening seam forming around the doorway. Cold darkness waited beyond it. The door moved only a few inches at first before stopping against years of rust and warped steel. Nathan leaned his shoulder into it carefully. With one final groan the hidden entrance slowly swung inward. A narrow stairwell descended beneath the station into darkness. Warm air drifted upward carrying the unmistakable smell of diesel fuel and old electricity. Nathan aimed his flashlight downward. Concrete steps disappeared deep below ground level, lined by rusted rail pipes and faded emergency lights mounted along the tunnel walls. Most were dead. But every seventh light still glowed faintly amber beneath layers of dust. Nathan's pulse quickened. Someone had maintained power down there. Or something had. Ranger hesitated at the top of the stairs before slowly descending the first few steps. His paws moved carefully, ears constantly twitching toward sounds Nathan could barely hear. Somewhere below them machinery hummed steadily through the darkness. Then came another sound. Voices. Faint and distorted through layers of tunnel echo. Nathan froze immediately. The voices sounded distant, almost impossible to understand, yet unmistakably human. Walter's face had gone completely pale now. "Dear Lord," he whispered. Eli stared into the stairwell with exhausted sorrow in his tired blue eyes. The mountain kept it alive all these years. Nathan turned toward him sharply. "What exactly is down there?" Eli swallowed slowly before answering. "Not a place," he said quietly. "A secret." The lights inside the station suddenly died. Darkness swallowed the waiting room completely except for Nathan's flashlight and the faint amber glow rising from the tunnel below. Outside, the signal bell stopped ringing all at once. Silence pressed heavily against the station walls. Then from somewhere deep beneath the mountain came the low thunder of steel wheels rolling slowly across underground tracks. Nathan descended the stairwell slowly with Ranger moving one step ahead of him into the underground darkness. The beam from his flashlight swept across damp concrete walls stained by decades of moisture and age. Old emergency pipes lined the tunnel ceiling overhead while faint amber lights flickered every several yards, casting weak pools of color against the shadows. Behind him, Eli and Walter remained at the top of the stairs, too afraid to follow but unable to leave. The heavy steel door stood open above them like the mouth of something long buried beneath the mountain. The deeper Nathan moved underground, the warmer the air became. Snow and winter disappeared behind him, replaced by the stale scent of machinery, oil, dust, and old electricity. Ranger's ears twitched constantly as the distant sound of rolling steel echoed through the tunnels ahead. Nathan counted his steps automatically out of habit. 32 stairs down. Then another corridor stretched forward beneath the station itself. Thick cables ran along the walls beside faded warning signs nearly erased by time. Restricted access. Authorized freight personnel only. The tunnel curved gently downward until the station above disappeared completely behind layers of rock and concrete. Nathan's flashlight swept across old maintenance lockers, rusted tool carts, and abandoned rail equipment left untouched for decades. Yet despite the age, nothing down there felt truly dead. Somewhere ahead, generators still hummed steadily through the mountain. Ranger suddenly stopped. The dog's body stiffened while his amber eyes focused toward the darkness farther down the corridor. Nathan heard it moments later. Voices again. Faint and distorted through tunnel echoes. Not conversations exactly. More like fragments of announcements drifting through old speakers. Track 3 now arriving. Static swallowed the words before silence returned. Nathan's pulse quickened beneath his coat. The tunnel finally opened into a massive underground chamber carved directly into the mountain itself. Nathan froze at the entrance. Ranger stepped beside him slowly, tail low, eyes wide with alert focus. The flashlight beam swept across steel rails stretching through the enormous cavern below. An entire hidden rail platform sat buried beneath Black Hollow Station. Underground tracks disappeared into dark tunnels on both ends of the chamber while ancient floodlights cast dim yellow glows across the concrete walls. Old freight crates sat stacked near loading docks covered in military markings from the early 1950s. Massive generators lined one side of the chamber, still humming quietly after all these years. But it was the train itself that stopped Nathan cold. A long black locomotive rested silently on the underground tracks as though waiting for departure. Dust coated its steel body, yet faint warmth still rose from the engine vents. The number painted along the side had nearly faded away except for one visible sequence. 217, Ranger released a soft whine beside him. Nathan moved slowly closer. The locomotive looked preserved rather than abandoned. Windows intact. Brass handles polished by time instead of rusted away. The heavy freight cars attached behind it carried faded military insignias beneath layers of dust and soot. One car door stood partially open several yards down the platform. Nathan's flashlight drifted across stacks of wooden crates marked with government transport seals. Beside them sat rows of filing cabinets and metal lockboxes untouched since another era. It looked less like a lost train and more like an entire secret operation hidden beneath the mountain. Nathan stepped onto the underground platform carefully. His boots echoed softly through the cavern. Ranger stayed close beside him, constantly scanning the darkness between the freight cars. Then Nathan noticed something that made his chest tighten. Fresh footprints covered parts of the dust along the platform floor. Not many. But recent. Someone else had been down there. Somewhere above them the station groaned faintly against the winter storm overhead. The underground chamber remained warm and eerily still beneath the mountain. Nathan slowly approached the locomotive engine itself. A brass conductor plate remained attached beside the cab window. He brushed years of dust from it carefully with his sleeve. The engraved letters beneath made his breath catch in his throat. Command Transport Division. Captain Henry Holloway. Nathan stared at the brass conductor plate while the underground chamber hummed softly around him like some buried machine still dreaming beneath the mountain. Command Transport Division. Captain Henry Holloway. His father had spoken that name only a handful of times when Nathan was young. Henry Holloway had been Nathan's grandfather, a railroad engineer who disappeared before Nathan was born. The family story had always been simple. A train accident in the mountains. No body recovered. End of story. But standing there now beneath Black Hollow, Nathan realized the truth had never been that simple. Ranger pressed close against his leg, his ears twitching toward the dark rail tunnel stretching deeper beneath the mountain. Nathan slowly brushed more dust away from the brass plate. The engraved surface gleamed faintly beneath the flashlight beam as though someone had polished it recently. His pulse tightened in his chest. Those fresh footprints on the platform suddenly felt far more important than before. Someone still came down here. Somewhere in the distance came the soft crackle of an old speaker system waking briefly to life. Static hissed overhead through rusted ceiling intercoms. Freight clearance confirmed. The voice faded into distortion before silence swallowed it again. Nathan stepped carefully toward the partially open freight car several yards down the platform. Ranger followed immediately, staying so close their shadows merged together beneath the amber floodlights. The freight car door groaned softly as Nathan slid it open wider. Inside sat dozens of military crates stacked floor to ceiling beneath thick layers of dust. Most carried faded transport labels from the early 1950s. But one section near the back held something different. Filing cabinets. Locked metal containers. Leather document cases marked classified in peeling white paint. Nathan opened one carefully. Inside rested hundreds of yellowed paper files tied neatly with military ribbon. Maps. Freight schedules. Financial ledgers. Letters. He pulled one folder free and froze immediately when he saw the handwriting on the cover. Henry Holloway. Personal authorization logs. Nathan opened the folder slowly while Ranger kept watch near the freight car entrance. The first pages contained freight manifests and underground rail diagrams beneath the mountain. Hidden tunnels. Secret storage chambers. Government transport routes never listed on public maps. But deeper inside the file Nathan found handwritten journal entries in faded black ink. December 18, 1953. If these records survive, then the truth survived with them. Nathan swallowed hard and kept reading beneath the flashlight glow. We were ordered to move the reserve beneath Black Hollow before winter sealed the pass. Gold reserves. War bonds. Recovery funds intended for families who lost sons overseas. But somebody higher up planned to erase the records and redirect everything once the storm arrived. Nathan's heartbeat slowed heavily in his chest. The next page trembled slightly in his hands. I could not let them steal what belonged to grieving families. So we hid the train beneath the mountain until the government could no longer reach it before the storm buried the tunnels. Nathan stared at the words silently while the distant hum of generators echoed through the cavern. His grandfather had not died in an accident. He had hidden the train deliberately. Ranger suddenly lifted his head sharply toward the darkness beyond the freight car. A faint metallic clang echoed somewhere deeper in the underground chamber. Nathan closed the file immediately. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. Moving somewhere beyond the locomotive. Ranger growled low in his throat while Nathan switched off the flashlight instinctively. Darkness swallowed the freight car except for the faint amber tunnel lights outside. The footsteps stopped. Silence pressed heavily through the chamber once more. Then from somewhere beyond the train came the sound of an old man's voice speaking softly through the dark. Henry always said the mountain would return the truth when the right Holloway finally came home. Nathan slowly turned toward the darkness beyond the locomotive while Ranger stepped protectively in front of him, ears high and muscles tense beneath his thick silver-gray coat. The underground chamber had gone strangely quiet now. Even the generators seemed softer somehow, their steady hum swallowed beneath the weight of the old voice echoing through the cavern. Faint amber tunnel lights flickered across the freight cars while dust drifted lazily through the warm underground air. Then an old man emerged slowly from the shadows near the far side of the platform. He moved carefully with one hand resting against the side of the train for balance. His gray coat looked decades old, heavy wool stitched with faded railroad patches near the collar. A thick white beard framed his weathered face, and his pale blue eyes carried the strange calm of someone who had spent too many years alone with silence. Ranger growled softly at first but stopped when the old man lowered his gaze toward the dog. "Good Shepherd," he whispered gently. "Still guarding the tracks after all this time?" Nathan stared at him carefully. "Who are you?" The old man stepped closer into the amber light. "Name is Samuel Vance," he said quietly. "I was freight engineer on this line back in 1953. Nathan felt his chest tighten slightly. "That is impossible." Samuel gave a faint tired smile. "Most truths are after enough years pass." The underground chamber creaked softly around them while somewhere deep in the tunnel's distant rails groaned beneath unseen pressure. Samuel looked toward the locomotive beside them with quiet affection. "Your grandfather saved more people than anyone ever knew." Nathan held the journal folder tightly in his hand. "He hid the train." Samuel nodded slowly. "The reserve inside these freight cars was supposed to disappear after the war. Gold. Bonds. Relief funds meant for widows and soldiers' families. Powerful men wanted it buried quietly." His pale eyes drifted toward the stacked freight crates farther down the platform. Henry refused. Nathan listened silently while Ranger slowly relaxed beside him, though the dog never stopped watching the tunnels beyond the chamber. Samuel continued speaking in the low steady voice of an old railroad man remembering ghosts. "The storm gave us cover. We brought the train underground before the pass collapsed with snow. The government sealed the station afterward thinking everyone down here died." Nathan looked around the hidden chamber again. "But you stayed." Samuel nodded once. "Someone had to guard the truth." Silence settled softly between them while warm air drifted upward from the old generators. Nathan's flashlight swept briefly across the freight cars again. Rows of sealed military lockboxes stretched through the underground station like sleeping history beneath the mountain. Samuel stepped toward one of the nearby cargo containers and unlocked it carefully with a brass key hanging from his neck. Inside rested stacks of preserved paper bundles wrapped tightly against moisture and time. Nathan stared in disbelief. War bonds. Treasury certificates. Letters tied with faded ribbon. Entire files listing names of fallen soldiers and relief payments never delivered to their families. Samuel lifted one letter gently from the box. "Your grandfather kept records of every family meant to receive help." His voice lowered slightly. He believed one day somebody honest would finish what he started. Nathan looked down at the letter in Samuel's hands. The envelope carried a military widow's name dated December 1953. Never opened. Never delivered. Something heavy shifted quietly inside Nathan's chest. All those years wandering after the war. All those nights. Believing he had lost purpose somewhere overseas. Yet somehow the mountain had brought him here. Ranger suddenly lifted his head toward the tunnel entrance again. A faint whistle echoed softly through the underground darkness, low and mournful like a train calling from another lifetime. Samuel smiled faintly toward the sound. Henry used to say the tracks remember kindness longer than men do. Nathan stood silently beside the hidden train while warm amber light flickered across the forgotten vault beneath Black Hollow. And for the first time in many years, the emptiness inside him no longer felt quite so cold. Spring arrived slowly to Black Hollow after the hardest winter the valley had seen in years. Snow melted from the mountainsides in silver streams that fed the river below town, and for the first time in decades the old station no longer stood silent above the tracks. Warm lantern light glowed through restored windows each evening while the sound of hammers, laughter, and distant music drifted softly through the valley air. Nathan Holloway stood on the platform one quiet morning watching sunlight spill across the rails in long golden ribbons. Ranger rested beside him beneath the old station sign, older now around the muzzle but peaceful in a way Nathan had never seen before. The station had changed over the past months. Fresh paint covered the waiting room walls. The broken roof had been rebuilt. The brass clock above the ticket counter still pointed at 2:17 every night before dawn, though Nathan no longer tried to fix it. Some things, he had learned, were not broken. They were reminders. The hidden underground chamber remained sealed from the public beneath layers of reinforced steel and stone, but its purpose had finally been honored. With Samuel Vance's help and the recovered records from the freight cars, Nathan spent months tracking the families listed in Henry Holloway's journals. Widow relief funds finally reached grandchildren who never knew the money existed. Old war bonds restored struggling homes across 3 states. Forgotten names buried beneath government archives returned quietly into the light. Black Hollow changed too. Travelers began stopping at the station again after hearing stories about the mysterious restoration in the mountains. Nathan turned the old depot into a shelter for veterans passing through the valley and a small museum honoring railroad workers, soldiers, and the families who carried silent grief through generations. People who once avoided the station now gathered there on cold evenings drinking coffee beneath warm lights while Ranger wandered from table to table accepting scratches behind the ears like an old guardian finally at rest. Eli Turner often sat beside the potbelly stove telling railroad stories to children while snow or rain drifted softly against the station windows outside. Walter Grady helped restore the old signal tower one careful bolt at a time despite his age. And every once in a while Samuel Vance appeared quietly from the mountain paths carrying another forgotten file or letter from the underground vault beneath Black Hollow. He always vanished again before sunrise like a man who belonged more to memory than time itself. One evening late in autumn, Nathan stood alone beside Track 3 while the valley settled into silence around him. The sky above the mountains burned deep orange beneath the setting sun, and cold wind carried the scent of pine and distant rain through the rail yard. Ranger sat quietly beside him watching the empty tracks stretching toward the forest. Nathan looked down the line where snow had once hidden impossible lights beneath the storm. So much of his life had felt like wandering after the war. Empty roads. Empty rooms. Empty years spent searching for something he could never quite name. But standing there now, listening to the station breathe softly behind him, he finally understood something his grandfather had known long ago. Sometimes the world hides its greatest kindness in forgotten places until the right person is ready to find it. The old brass clock inside the station suddenly rang once through the evening silence. Nathan smiled faintly without turning around. Ranger lifted his head toward the mountains. Then, far beyond the valley, a train whistle echoed softly through the autumn air. Long, low. Peaceful. Nathan closed his eyes for a moment while the sound drifted across the tracks like a farewell carried gently through time itself. When he opened them again, the rails ahead shimmered gold beneath the dying sunlight, stretching endlessly